Hello, my name is Paul Slovic. I'm happy to talk to you this morning in a general lecture on the psychology of risk, but focused on some of the most serious problems facing the world these days, and the fact that as the problems get more serious, we tend to underreact and do too little to address them. So as you can see from the title, the more who die, the less we care, is the thing I'll be talking about, confronting the deadly arithmetic of compassion. So let's get right into this. About a year ago, there was this warning from the United Nations that says that humanity's broken risk perception is reversing global progress in a spiral of self-destruction. And this is a very serious assertion, obviously. And specifically, it says the world could undo social and economic advances and face 1.5 disasters a day by 2030, according to UN's flagship Global Assessment Report. I think they're referring here to natural disasters, but it could be as well other types of major problems that are increasing in severity and that we're underreacting to. And it continues, by ignoring risk and failing to integrate it in decision-making, the world is effectively bankrolling its own destruction. The good news is that human decisions are the largest contributors to disaster risk. So we have the power to substantially reduce the threats posed to humanity, and especially the most vulnerable among us. So I hope that what I'll be talking about this morning will give you a glimpse into why we are in this situation, and as a result of poor decision making and poor, strange way that our minds process information about risk. And armed with that knowledge, I hope that it will enable us to make better decisions in the future. So the path of this talk is shown here. I'll start with something called heuristics, which are mental strategies for simplifying difficult judgments about risk. And these work well, but are sometimes very wrong. And one of the important heuristics that I'll spend a lot of time on this morning, and one of the most important heuristics that I'll spend a lot of time in this lecture, is called the Affect Heuristic. And it has to do with feelings. Affect is just jargon for feelings. The feelings are essential to understanding information about risk and motivating protective actions. We fail to protect lives because our feelings deceive us. Something called psychic numbing is one of these factors I'll describe, and also false feelings of inefficacy, and something called the prominence effect. These create a deadly arithmetic of compassion and indifference towards catastrophic risks. And this is where the phrase comes from, the more who die, the less we care. This is the way our feelings respond to large problems facing humanity. And examples of this have to do with poor decision making regarding COVID and pandemics, climate change, genocide, and nuclear war. I'll touch briefly on COVID and climate change, but focus more later on in the lecture on genocide and nuclear war. So these heuristics are mental strategies that simplify a complex judgment or decision by substituting an easier response for a more difficult one. And as I mentioned earlier, these are very useful but often wrong. And I'm going to talk now about two important heuristics for making risk judgments. One's called the Availability Heuristic. The second is called the Affect Heuristic. So what is availability? It's a strategy by which we judge the frequency or probability of an event, which is a hard thing to do actually, by how easy it is to remember or imagine that event happening. And so that's an easier judgment, but it's often wrong. For example, research shows that when Americans are asked which of two causes of death is more likely, most respondents get this wrong on these example pairs that I'll give you. So for example, consider stroke or accidents. Which is more common or frequent as a cause of death in the United States? Well, most people believe it's accidents, and they're wrong. And in fact, they think accidents are 25 times more likely in the study I'm referring to, even though a stroke is more common as a cause of death. And also, accidental deaths in the research we've conducted were judged as more likely than diseases, though diseases were 15 times more frequent. And frequency judgments tend to be biased upwards by the frequency of newspaper stories about these causes of death. So these mistaken judgments are all because we give greater likelihood or frequency assertions to things that are easier to recall, and accidents are obviously more visible and more easier to recall than diseases, and same thing about stroke and so forth. So this is availability. The affect heuristic is one that I'll spend a lot more time on. Affect is jargon. It means a feeling. It's a feeling of goodness or badness associated with a stimulus being some event that's happening. And when we think very quickly and intuitively, this, what we call fast thinking, is strongly influenced by affective feelings. So affect is like a compass that guides our behavior and our decisions throughout the day. We make a lot of decisions during the day. We're not often doing any kinds of calculations there. We're sort of just thinking about something we might do, and we get a feeling about that, and that feeling is, if it's a positive feeling, we go ahead with it. If it's a negative feeling, we may change our mind. So this is the way our feelings are our compass. And so reliance on affect is called the affect heuristic. And because judgments of risk, which are hard to do, are often based on how good or bad the event at issue makes us feel, which is easy. So it's easy to go with our feelings. So some of our feelings are innate. I think we're hardwired to react in a negative way to a loud noise, perhaps a wiggling snake in front of us. But most of our feelings are learned. They're taught to us by our parents or our culture, or the books we're given to read as children, like this one, which shows us all the different things that are good or bad in the world. So this is the way we, in part, learn feelings. So one of the important things to know about affective feelings is that they are closely linked to the meaning of information. So these feelings, these affective feelings, convey meaning upon information. And without affect, information lacks meaning and will not be used in judgment and decision making. So these affective feelings are a key ingredient of rational behavior. And as I mentioned earlier, they sometimes lead to poor decision making. So there's a concept called evaluability. It just simply means judgments in which we evaluate something in some way. And work by Christopher Shih at the University of Chicago is very central to this and very informative. He said that to say that an attribute is hard to evaluate means that people don't know whether a given value on this attribute is good or bad. Lacking feeling or affect, the attribute will not influence judgments and decisions. And he has some very interesting examples of this. So in this example, consider that you're in the market for a used dictionary, not a modern online dictionary, but one, a hard copy of a dictionary. And there are two dictionaries that you're considering. They're both published in 1993. Dictionary A has 10,000 entries, and it's like new. Dictionary B has 20,000 entries, and it has a slight defect. The cover is tore. Otherwise, it's like new. And so the question that Christopher Shih asked his respondents is, how much would you offer to pay to a used bookseller for each of these dictionaries. And if you do it with these dictionaries side by side, and you see this information side by side, it's what's called joint evaluation. If you look over to the graph on the right side, the amount offered, average amount offered for these, you see that dictionary B, the average offer is $27, A is $19. So people offer more for dictionary B. Why is that? It's because it's got twice as many entries, and the defect is minor. But now supposing that you have two different groups of people, they only see one of these dictionaries, and they make an offer for a single dictionary. That's called separate evaluation, and that's over on the right of those two bar graphs. So separately, dictionary A gets a higher offer. Why? It's because people don't know how to evaluate 10,000 entries by itself. I mean, they can evaluate compared to 20,000, but here they don't have a comparison. It's just a number, 10,000. So it's kind of fuzzy in meaning. It doesn't convey a strong feeling of how good or bad it is. But being like new is obviously good. So the being new, that carries the feeling and gives it a strong offer, makes people pay $24 on average for it. When they see dictionary B, they see the 20,000, but they don't have a comparison. They don't know how good or bad 20,000 is, but they don't like the fact that the cover is torn. That carries negative feelings, and that depresses the amount offered for dictionary B down to $20. So in separate evaluation, A gets higher value than B because of the failure to understand, to evaluate the numbers by themselves. Here's another example from Christopher. She has a lot of clever examples. He says, supposing you're at the beach on a hot day and you want to get some ice cream, and there's two vendors. So vendor H offers you 8 ounces of ice cream in a 10-ounce cup, so it doesn't reach the top of the cup. And vendor L offers 7 ounces of ice cream in a smaller cup, so it overflows the cup. So again, if people are asked how much would you pay for the ice cream, so if you see them side by side, people pay more for H because it gives you more ice cream. But if you see them one at a time, so if you see these two cups side by side, people offer more for H because it has more ice cream. But if you see only a single cup, if you have two groups of people and one is making an offer for H and the other is making an offer for L, L gets a higher offer in terms of what people are willing to pay under separate evaluation. And this happens because underfilling a cup is seen as bad, and overfilling a cup is seen as good. And if that's, if you're only seeing one cup, that dominates the response. Here again, a difference between separate and joint evaluation. And interestingly, I happened to be driving on a road in Kenya a few years later, and I saw someone selling buckets of potatoes, and they were all overfilled. So this seller obviously knew that it was good to overfill your containers. That gave an aura of positive affect to what you were selling. So let's talk about what we call the affect heuristic then. And this originated out of risk perception studies that I did with Sarah Lichtenstein and Brooke Fischoff around 1980, and where we found that perceived risk was closely related to feelings of dread associated with a hazard. If people said that when they thought about a certain risk, like flying in a plane, if they had a feeling of dread or strong anxiety about it, that was high risk. We also noticed in those studies that perceived risk and perceived benefit were inversely or oppositely related. So here's what I mean by that. These little dots in the figure are different types of hazards: driving in a car, taking prescription drugs, flying in a plane, so forth. And if you think about the benefit that these offer to us and the risk that they pose, in general, the risk and benefit are positively related. Things that are high in benefit on the right of this figure might be low in risk, they might be high in risk. But if they're low in benefit, they don't tend to be high in risk. We tend to try to eliminate objects in the upper left of that figure because they're low in benefit. Why take the risk? So in the world, risk and benefit are positively related. Now, if you ask people to judge the risk and benefit of each of these objects, of these activities, you get just the opposite picture. You get a strongly negative picture, that if something is judged as high in benefit, it's judged low in risk, and if it's judged low in benefit, it's judged high in risk. And this is what it looks like with actual data on different, in a study with looking at things like asbestos, nuclear power, biotechnology, vaccinations, and so forth. You see that the risk and benefit judgments go in an inverse relationship. So this has to do with 43 technologies and 500 people judging them. Strong negative relationship. And about 15 years later, a student of mine, Ali Al-Hakami, found that this inverse or negative relationship between risk and benefit judgments for any particular hazard, say think about nuclear power, what's its risk, what's its benefit, it depends on the degree to which a person judged that that hazardous activity is good or bad. And here's what it looks like in actual data, where high values are high in either are high on the benefit or risk judgment scales. So think about two hazards that expose us to radiation: nuclear power and X-rays. So nuclear power, which is in this survey, the people judging nuclear power tended not to like nuclear power very well. So they judged its benefits low and its risks high. On the other hand, medical X-rays were more favorably perceived. They had carried more positive feeling, and their benefits were judged as high and the risks were low. Same thing happened with chemicals. You have the bad chemicals, pesticides, which are just the chemicals perceived as bad by this sample of respondents. They judge the benefits as low and the risks as high. And more favorably evaluated drugs, more positive affect associated with prescription medicines, the benefits are judged as high and the risks are low. So you see these judgments going in opposite directions. And this is not necessarily the way the world is. Prescription drugs can have both high benefit and high risk. They don't necessarily have low risk. And so this led to the creation of, or an idea, which then we turned into a heuristic called the Affect Heuristic, which means when people are judging the benefit or risk of some activity, they first consult their feelings. In this case, we asked them about how do you feel, judge the benefit and risk of a nuclear waste repository for storing nuclear waste. So people sort of sensed in their mind, well, how do I feel about this? Do I think this is a good thing or a bad thing? And then they derive the perceived benefit and perceived risk judgments based on their feelings. Okay, so they have an overall affective evaluation, and that comes first, and the risk and benefit judgments come second. So I'm going to give you a few examples now of this affect heuristic, the way it works. And I'll talk about judging risk, that's judging probability and frequency information in communicating risk. Something called pseudo-certainty, an example with airplane safety, something called the 5-cent loss effect. And I'm going to then, these are all sort of experiments on rather not so critical issues except for the airplane safety. Well, pseudo-certainty is also important. Anyway, then I'm going to transition to really serious things like nuclear war and indifference towards genocide. All of these are influenced by affective feelings in rather strange ways. So here's the question about probabilities and frequencies. You can communicate the likelihood of something with as a probability or as a relative frequency. And here's, for example, you can say there's a 20% chance of something bad happening, or you could say it happens 20 out of 100 times. Now, these are really the same things. The percent next to the 20 means out of 100. It's the same information. But if you give people this information about some event, you may get a different reaction. So in this case, this is taken from a real situation where psychologists or psychiatrists have to evaluate whether it's safe to release a patient who, from a mental health facility where this patient has been treated for past several weeks for perhaps being violent. So a psychologist whose opinion you respect has done a state-of-the-art assessment of Mr. Jones and concluded the following. This is the information given to psychologists and psychiatrists who were serving as respondents in a survey we were asking. So one group was told that patients similar to Jones are estimated to have a 20% probability of being violent to others during the first several weeks after discharge. And the question is, would you discharge this person? The other group of respondents was told of every 100 patients similar to Jones, 20 would be estimated to commit an act of violence to others during the first several weeks after discharge. Would you discharge Jones? So 20%, 20 out of 100. What is the percentage of responders who said, do not discharge Jones? Here's what it looks like. It's almost double the percent when it's the frequency format, 20 out of 100 patients like Jones. That 41% of the psychiatrists and psychologists said don't discharge Jones. When the other group was told that Jones has a 20% probability, only 21% says don't discharge Jones. What is going on here? Well, why does it happen? It's because frequency formats produce more violent imagery and more negative affect, negative feelings, and that leads to the different risk judgments. Here's an example in a follow-up study where we compared Jones with a 10% chance of being violent or a 1 out of 10 chance. And we asked responders, as they were thinking about whether they would discharge Jones, what was going through their minds. And so when they were told that Jones had a 10% chance, the thoughts were, well, very few people are violent. 10% is 1 out of 10, probably won't hurt anyone. This is a small percentage. People who were told that 1 out of 10 people like Jones could be violent, 1 out of 10 chance, they were imaging in their mind someone being violent. He could be the one that should be 1 out of 10 instead of 1 out of 1. He could be the 1 out of 10. They were thinking about some guy going crazy and killing people, the patient attacking someone, an act of violence. There has to be at least 1 in 10. Mr. Jones could very well be that one. So here you see that the 1 out of 10 framing of this information created images that were highly negative and conveying negative feelings, and that led to decisions, more decisions not to discharge Jones, even though it's the same, logically it's the same information. This is the way affective feelings influence us, and the way the framing of the information influences our feelings. We also, in follow-up studies, found that this effect is stronger with people who have difficulty thinking about numbers, low in what we call numeracy. If you look over on the left, What we're seeing here is the difference between the rated risk when shown the probability as 10% or 10 out of 100 in this case. And you see that it's there's a big difference there among people who are low in numeric ability. People who are high in numeric ability, there wasn't any difference, and it was also similar to the 10 out of 100 with a low numeracy. So numeracy is related to the response here. So here's another affective bias we call pseudo-certainty. It's a study that showed that 100% protection against half the problem is preferred over 50% protection against the whole problem when the overall protection is the same in both cases. So the story had to do with vaccination against two equally likely strains of a influenza-like disease, strain A and strain B. And one vaccine, you're considering two types of vaccine. One gives, actually it's different groups of people. One group is told that the vaccine gives 100% protection from strain A and no protection against B, and these are equally likely strains. And the second was told that the vaccine gives 50% protection against A and B together. And in both cases, the vaccine reduces the risk from 20% to 10%, cuts it in half. Well, people much prefer the being vaccinated where you get 100% protection from one of the strains. A follow-up study by Lee and Chapman found very similar results, and the title of their paper was 100% of anything looks good, the appeal of 100%. And they had a similar vaccination kind of problem, and they found that a vaccine that was described as 100% effective against 70% of different diseases was preferred to one described as 70% effective against 100% of the various disease targets. So again, the 100% effective sounds really good and leads to choices of the 100%. So yet another example is the fact that when you give a proportion of lives saved, this sometimes carries much more affective meaning than if you just say the number of lives saved. So for example, in separate evaluations where people just get one item to judge, there will likely be more support for saving 85% of 150 lives at risk than for saving 150 lives at risk. Why is that? Well, saving 150 lives is good, but it's kind of vaguely good. You don't exactly know how good it is. But saving 85% feels very good. There's more positive feeling because 85% is a high percentage. What about saving 90% or 95% or 98% of 150 lives? Well, all of those percentages of 150 lives are judged better than saving 150 lives when people are only seeing one of these combinations of percentage of lives. And this comes from a study that was using a scenario that has to do with airport safety. And it says, imagine you're a member of an emergency response committee at the Eugene, Oregon airport. There's a proposal before your committee to purchase some expensive new equipment for use in the event of a crash landing of an airliner. The circumstances that might require that such equipment to be used are rare but important. So imagine over a 10-year period, there's about 1 chance in 1,000 that the equipment would be needed one time, and it would save the 150 lives on average that would be in jeopardy. Thus, the benefit of this equipment could be portrayed by the gamble. There's 1 chance in 1,000 to save 150 lives. And critics argue that you could spend this money better in other ways to enhance airport safety. And so how strongly would you support this proposed measure to purchase new equipment? And you rated your support on a 0 to 20 scale of support. And let's say that and you only see this one possibility here. A second group was given the same scenario, but they were told not that that this measure would save 150 lives on average, but there's one chance in 100 to save 98% of 150 lives in general. How much would you support it? And here's what the data show. Again, these are 5 different groups, seeing only one combination here. So the group that was told it would save 150 lives on average rated the support level about 10, kind of middle of the range. The group that was told it would save 98% of 150 rated it as 13.6, much higher. 95%, it starts to drop. As you lower the percentage, it starts to drop to 12.9 and 11.7 and 10.9. You can see it on the graph. But even at 85%, you're getting slightly higher support than for 150 lives at risk. So what is happening here? Basically, again, it's that 150 lives is just a number. You don't quite know how good or bad it is. But you do know that saving a high percentage of lives is something good. So you get better, more positive affect from the fraction, the proportion, than the actual number. And you rate the saving fewer lives is rated higher because it's a high percentage. Rather strange way to respond. So here's another example where comparisons can create affect and meaning for a number that's not very meaningful by itself. So do you know the meaning of $9? And if you're in a country where you have a different kind of currency than dollars, substitute some small amount of your currency in thinking about this problem of $9. No, well, everyone would say, yeah, I know the meaning of this. I buy and sell things all the time. I know the meaning of $9. But what if the circumstance is a little bit unusual? I mean, it's not that you're in a store purchasing something familiar. It's that you're offered a gamble that has $9 as the payoff. And let's say it's played on a roulette wheel where there are 7 winning numbers out of 36. And so you have 7 chances out of 36 to win $9. And as you see below the gamble, you say that, that if you don't win, there's 29 chances out of 36 that you'll win nothing. So win $9 or win nothing. And it says, visualize this wheel and then rate how attractive this gamble would be to play it. And we're going to give you a bunch of gambles, and the gambles that you rated as more attractive, it'll be more likely you get to play those gambles that you rated more attractive. So how attractive is this on a 0 to 20 scale? Now we have a second group. Everything's the same, except now instead of, if you don't win the $9, instead of winning nothing, you lose a nickel. Okay, small loss. How attractive is that gamble? Well, if you put the gambles side by side and people rate each of them, they give the first gamble a rating on average of 13, and the second gamble gets a rating just under 10. They give a higher rating to the gamble without the loss. That makes sense. But supposing you only see one of these gambles, and then another group sees the second one, and you look at the average rating, it's just the opposite in what we call separate evaluation. Gets back to that evaluability stuff. So now a group that sees only gamble 1 gives it a rating of 9.4 on average. The group that sees gamble 2 gives it a rating of 14. So this is weird. What's going on? Well, it turns out that people seeing a single gamble rate it poorly because they don't know how good or bad $9 is in this context. So it doesn't carry any particular feeling. But they know that 7 out of 36 chances to win is a poor chance. So that's what carries the feeling. They have a negative feeling because it has a bad probability of winning. And they don't really know how good or bad $9 is. So they rate it rather poorly. But you adding the 5-cent loss makes $9 come alive with feeling because it's so much bigger than the loss. And so now you have the group that sees the 5-cent loss has a whole different perception of $9, which is very positive, and that raises the evaluation. And we can show that by asking people to rate how good or bad $9 is in these two various conditions. And what we see, if they're rating the $9 here in the condition where there's no loss, you see that the dominant rating, you see the highest error, 40% of the people rate the feeling that they get from the $9 as neutral, versus only 21% when there's a 5-cent loss. If you look down to the 3s and 4s, which are very positive feelings, you see that the gamble with a small loss, the $9 gets 24% 3s and 20% 4s. 44% of the people rate the feeling for $9 as very high when there's a nickel loss, and only 9% rated highly when there's no loss. So $9, which you should know the meaning of, you gain meaning through the comparison with a small loss here. So what have we learned from these gambles? That the importance of small contextual factors like this 5-cent loss is very, very important. The meaning and importance of even a very familiar and well understood numerical monetary outcome such as $9 is not fixed, but depends greatly on these contextual factors. And when numbers, that should be numbers, not nubers, when numbers do not convey feeling, they lack meaning and have little or no impact on judgments regarding money or lives. That was the airport safety example, involved lives. And what about the same thing? What happened with decisions about, say, nuclear war? Well, the answer we'll see in a minute. Can we change affect and meaning in a decision affecting many thousands of lives by introducing comparisons, as in the gamble study? And we have an unpublished, very recent study, survey experiment with about 500 Americans that show that the answer is yes. And this survey describes a hypothetical war between the US and a country. I won't name the country. It was named in the scenario, but we'll call it country X. And they don't have nuclear weapons, but we got involved in a war here. So basically, this is what the scenario says, and is shown to people who are going to make a judgment about whether or not to use nuclear weapons in this battle. So the U.S. is sanctioning country X economically to punish them because they violated a nuclear treaty not to process uranium that might be used for nuclear weapons. And then country X retaliates about these sanctions by attacking the U.S. A very difficult ground war ensues. And we're told that the U.S. will eventually win this war, but we may lose 20,000 troops if the war continues. And the military is considering dropping a nuclear bomb on country X to end the war and protect the U.S. troops. And there's two conditions. In one condition, we're told that if we drop the nuclear bomb on country X, 100,000 civilians of that country would be expected to die. And a second group is told 2 million civilians might be expected to die. And then the person is asked, would you support our government's decision to use a nuclear weapon, killing 100,000 in one case or 2 million in a second condition? They only see one of these conditions. So let's say we add then a third condition to the decision. So in the first two conditions, they're judging whether to use the bomb or continue the ground war. Now, in this condition, we give them two possibilities for the bombing. Would you support a decision by the American government to drop a nuclear bomb on a city in country X to end the war and protect 20,000 soldiers? Or should we continue the ground war? Condition one, the bomb would be expected to kill 100,000 civilians. Condition two, 2 million civilians. Condition three, there are two possible locations. Location A is expected to kill 100,000 civilians. Location B would be expected to kill 2 million civilians. And so the decision in each of these three different conditions is, would you support dropping the bomb, or would you support continuing the ground war and possibly losing 20,000 soldiers? And there's a different response in the third condition. So in condition one, 21% of our respondents supported dropping the nuclear bomb that might kill 100,000. Condition 2, 19% supported the strike that might kill 2 million. Interesting here that even though condition 2, there's 20 times higher expected fatality rate, you get the same support. This is a failure to, in separate evaluation, to see much difference between 100,000 and 2 million. It's a form of what we call psychic numbing. Now condition 3, we see that 30% of the people supported the strike on 100,000 people. 6% supported the strike on the 2 million people. So if you sum those two and say the percent supporting a nuclear strike, you get 36% in total. Well, that's much higher than the 21% and the 19% when you only had one option. So what's going on here is, just as with these simple gambles, comparisons change the affect, the feelings, and the support decision. So 100,000 looks good in comparison with 2 million, and 2 million looks bad in comparison with 100,000. Well, this is weird and terrible. You shouldn't have to compare 100,000 to 2 million to know that it is bad to kill 100,000 people. You know, both nuclear options are greatly disproportionate in the cost of lives. They're both unacceptable, and the comparison should not increase support for killing 100,000 civilians. But it's the same thing that happened with that trivial 5-cent loss gamble example, but in a much more serious situation. And this raises the question for the people who are in charge of our nuclear weapons program here and internationally. You know, how can we be assured that leaders who have control over nuclear weapons might not be influenced by their affective feelings in ways that are bizarre? So psychic numbing, the failure to attach feelings to numbers, this psychic numbing, and other cognitive biases also play an important role in obstructing effective decisions in the face of COVID-19 and other pandemic diseases and climate change. I don't have time to go into that today. I'm going to focus briefly on genocide and nuclear war as examples of this. And this, again, is central to the theme of this lecture: the more who die, the less we care. So relying on these feelings is a usual way to make judgments and decisions. This affect heuristic, because it's easy, it feels right, it usually works, but it can lead to serious mistakes. And we call this, relying on our feelings, in this case, the arithmetic of compassion. And it's a deadly arithmetic because it doesn't follow the laws of proper, our feelings don't do arithmetic right. So saving one life is huge. We have very positive, strong feelings that we need to do this. Saving a second life, or if there are two lives at risk, doesn't feel, it feels less important than saving two, and sometimes less important than saving one. So this is related to the fundamental question: how should we value the protection of human lives, and how do we value the protection of human lives? So here's some schematic examples of what's going on here. If we think of the answer to the should, how should we value saving human lives? This is what we call a normative model. Normative means should. Let's say we believe every human life is intrinsically of equal value. Then as the number of those lives at risk increase, the value of saving those lives, the importance of saving those lives should increase in a straight line, as shown on the left of this figure. Now, in some cases, we might want to think that this model should be tweaked a little bit, as if we're reaching a threshold where the next lives lost might tip the balance towards a genocide of a group, or the extinction of a species of animals, then the next lives are even more important to protect than the previous ones, so because they would create a tipping point towards extinction. So these are normative models of how we should value the saving of human lives. But when we do studies of how people actually do value the savings, or we look at what's going on in the world and we infer from the world events, what's happening, we get a very different picture, and it's because our actions in the face of threats to large numbers of people don't follow either of these normative models. It's because our feelings override our analytic judgments. The previous slide is sort of analytic thinking. And it's because our feelings value individual lives greatly but tend to be insensitive to large losses of life. As a result, we're too complacent about the catastrophic risks from large things that kill a lot of people, like genocide and war, climate change and pandemic disease, and many other serious problems facing the world. So here's a schematic of what both research shows about how we value lives as the number of lives at risk increase, and also what we know if we just look out the window at what's going on in the world. And the first one, it's not a straight line. You know, the very first line going from 0 to 1 shows a very steep increase in value. We value that single first life very highly, and then it starts to flatten out. It doesn't change much, and it's insensitive. And that's bad. What it means is that life that's so important, if it's the first life at risk, loses its value if it becomes, you know, the sixth or the seventh life. It doesn't matter as much. Well, but it's the same life. It's not logical. So, but it's even worse than that. Sometimes it doesn't. It's not that it just flattens out and we become insensitive. It's actually, it may fade or collapse. We may lose feeling completely. Our capacity to feeling is limited, and the lack of feeling, leads to inaction when large losses of life occur. I mean, it just collapses. It's just a number. It doesn't mean anything to us. So here's an example of the first model, the insensitivity. You see, going from 0 to 1, you see a big increase in value, and from 1 to 2, you see a lesser increase, and in some cases, actually, the importance actually is lower for 2 than for 1. And we call this the singularity effect. We place great value on saving individual lives. And Mother Teresa exemplified this when she said, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at one, I will." And I often have collected articles from a local newspaper that illustrate this. Often we see that individuals will risk their own lives to save someone else in danger, as in this example. The man on the left was driving a pickup truck. It went off the road and into that pond of water that you see in the background, and the man on the right was driving by. He saw this happening. He jumped out of his vehicle and into the water and risked his own life to rescue this man. We'll do a lot to rescue a single life in danger. It doesn't even have to be a human life. This is a story about a ship that was stranded in the Pacific Ocean, and they had engine trouble. They evacuated all the people off the ship, and they sort of left the ship drift, lost track of it, and then they realized there was this dog on board, and they went back and they searched for the ship and rescued the dog. They had the Coast Guard involved. They spent $300,000 to rescue this dog because it was a single important life here. Opposite singularity is psychic numbing. Compassion fade and compassion collapse, and as exemplified by genocides. So in Rwanda, 1994, 800,000 people were murdered in 100 days, about 8,000 a day, and the world watched and did nothing about it. Here's an example of research out of Israel by Kogut and Ritov that gives an example of, experimental example of this kind of lack of caring about more lives at risk. They created a scenario where there are 8 children being treated for cancer in a children's hospital, and they needed $300,000 for the treatment of the 8, and they asked people, how much would you donate towards the treatment? Then they had several other individual groups, and they showed them only one child of the 8. And they said, this child needs $300,000 for treatment. How much would you donate? And so it's the same amount. And here's what it looks like. When they have a single child and you're donating to a single child, the donations were far greater than when there were 8 people. You see the decrease here. In follow-up studies, my colleagues and I found that you could actually, it doesn't have to be 8, you actually can sometimes get a decline in feelings of compassion and donations to help 2 children compared to 1. So it starts to decline the response with 2 people in danger as opposed to 1. So basically we have found over and over again, and you see it in the world, that statistics of large numbers of people in danger or mass atrocities don't move us to act if they are emotionless. You know, in a sense, what we see in our experiments and what's going on today, I mean, we sort of know this. So a quote that was once attributed to Stalin, it's under dispute who said it, but it's very true anyway. 1 man's death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic. And another quote, which is again related to the affect heuristic, statistics are human beings with the tears dried off. Very insightful and powerful statement, and relating to what we're talking about here. So here's another example of how the statistics don't move us to act. The Syrian war in Syria started in 2011 when there were protests against the government of Bashar al-Assad. Wasn't helping the government, and the people were protesting. And instead of trying to negotiate and listen to the people and hear their causes, he started to quell these protests by having his military fire weapons at the protesters, killing protesters, and that just made things worse. And by 2012, about a year later, a lot of people had been killed, and they were pleading for help. And here's a statement by a Syrian woman who asked, "What's the world waiting for?" She was holed up in a makeshift bomb shelter with her 6th son, for us to die of hunger and fear. And this is a point in the war where 15,000 people had died when she made that statement. Well, what happened after she made that plea is shown in this graph. So the arrow points to when that statement was made, calling for help. 15,000 people have been killed by the Syrian government. And then you follow that along to September 2015, and you see the death toll rose steeply to about 250,000 people. And the world did not care. There was little interest in what was going on, and it changed overnight when this picture was taken of a little boy fleeing with his family from Syria, trying to get to Turkey, and their boat capsized, and he was washed ashore, having drowned. This went around the world. It stirred a lot of emotion. It carried affect, and finally the world woke up. And we could tell this. I did study with my colleagues from Sweden, and we tracked the searches on Google for Elan. That was the name of the little boy, and the word refugees and the word Syria. And you see there was no interest, you know, prior to that point of the picture. And you see the spike when, you know, happened when the photograph woke people up and they started thinking about refugees in Syria. And of course, searches on Google is one thing, but what does it mean behaviorally? Well, Sweden took in 150,000 Syrian refugees in the year 2015. And they set up a fund in the Swedish Red Cross to raise money to help care for those refugees. And that fund was perking along at about $8,000 a day before the photograph came out. Well, what happened when the photograph came out? You see, it went from $8,000 to $430,000 overnight when that photograph was released. And then you see it stayed elevated for another month or so, and then it went back down to baseline. So it took a photo and the emotional impact of that photo to create meaning and wake up the world in ways that 250,000 deaths did not. So we value individual human lives greatly in some circumstances. In other contexts, our actions impute little or no value to human life. The more who die, the less we care. Is this what we want, and what should we do about it? There's another strange thing that happens with regard to our feelings, and that has to do with whether we are motivated to help people in need. We're motivated to help others because they need our help, and we feel good when we believe our help makes a difference. We have a sense of its efficacy. But our feelings, we say our feelings have a poor gatekeeper. Our brains don't evaluate or vet information, the feelings that are coming into us from our senses. Non-relevant sources of negative feelings can command our attention and create an illusion of inefficacy that demotivates people who actually are capable of making a difference. So we observe this. Here's an experiment that offers people the opportunity to donate to a child who's starving, and to children like the one on the right, a little girl named Rokia, 7 years old, from Mali, desperately poor, faces a threat of severe hunger or even starvation. And her life and lives of children like her will be changed if you can donate to a good organization like Save the Children, who will work with these children and provide food and assistance to them. And people were given the opportunity to donate to Save the Children. It was an actual donation. And we found that a certain percentage of people in our sample population donated. And we thought, well, we could increase the number of people who donated and the amount they donated if we could emphasize how serious a problem this is in the region where these children live. So then we had another condition where the same opportunity to donate to Save the Children, same picture of the little girl, but next to her picture, as you see on the left, we gave statistics about the seriousness of the problem, the food shortages in the region affecting more than 3 million children and so forth. Okay. So we expected that we'd get more donations. Well, if you see at the bottom left of this slide, the donations to Rokia dropped by more than 40% when the statistics were presented. And basically what we learned was that the bad feelings that you get when you think about all the children you're not helping come in and mess up the good feelings you have about helping the single child. And so you don't help, even though you could still help. We call this pseudo-inefficacy. Pseudo because you really can help, but you don't because it doesn't feel as good to help this person when you realize there are many you're not helping. Knowing that there's even one child out of two whom you cannot help makes you feel less good about helping the child you can help and may cause you not to help that child. This is wrong. It's a failure of your fast intuitive thinking based on your feelings. But beyond numbing, beyond pseudo-inefficacy, there's another obstacle to valuing lives appropriately, and that's via faulty decision making. Even slow, reasoned decision making requiring trade-offs can be severely biased, causing our actions to contradict our stated values. We call this the prominence effect. So this basically is the fact that our choices or decisions value certain dimensions or outcomes, which we call prominent dimensions, very highly because of the need to justify or defend our actions. And when we say what our values are, we don't have to justify them. But when we make a choice, we feel the need to justify it. So there may be a disconnect between what we say is important to us and the values that our choices reveal. And one of the factors that is very prominent in influencing our decision is the need for security. And for governments, national security is the most prominent, that is the most defensible value in today's world. So strongly held humanitarian values about, say, saving lives, which we state as important to us, tend to decline or even collapse when they're pitted in a decision-making situation against security objectives. And we tend to say that it's important to save lives, but we choose to protect our security. So when humanitarian life-saving and national security seem to conflict, we may not intervene to prevent genocide or mass atrocities, no matter how many thousands or millions of lives are at risk. And prime examples in the genocide area are genocides that happened in the past in Rwanda and Darfur, and those that are happening in recent times in Sudan, Yemen, Syria, and other countries as we speak. So we can think of it as this: when we're trying to when our governments are trying to make a decision, and we're trying to weigh the protection of lives that are being abused, say in genocide actions, versus the risk to our own security by intervening, we think about, well, weighing these on some balance, but we actually don't use a balance. Our attention is limited, and we tend to focus on these prominent objectives, and we choose to obtain them. Prominence is like an attentional spotlight. Non-prominent aspects are neglected because we're not attending to them. So out of sight, out of mind. So we can call this a form of inattentional blindness. And here's what it looks like schematically. Instead of weighing them on the scale, our attention is all on national security, and we forget about the lives, and the decisions go in favor of national security, even though we say these values are important. Here's one of many examples when President Obama was asked about what was going on in Syria. At that time, there was 80,000 people had been killed. I remember it was well over 250,000 a bit after. And millions had lost their homes and became refugees. Obama recently said it's important for us to help these people, but he said also his bottom line has to be what's in the best interest of America's security, and we did not really intervene to help these people. He said, I have a solemn responsibility to keep the American people safe. That's my most important obligations as president, and we did very little to help in Syria. So psychic numbing and security prominence are even more evident in warfare than in indifference to genocide and other humanitarian crises. This man, Albert Szent-Györgyi, was a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist who became very concerned about nuclear war. And thinking about it, he said, I'm deeply moved if I see one man suffering and would risk my life for him. Remember, that's the singularity effect. He said, then I talk impersonally about the possible pulverization of our big cities with 100 million dead. I am unable to multiply one man's suffering by 100 million. Our feelings can't do multiplication. They can't do addition. They can't do multiplication. We have to think more carefully in a non-feeling way to appreciate what's going on here. And you see this very evident in World War II, this psychic numbing and security prominence. General Curtis LeMay was in charge of a firebombing campaign against German and Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. 100,000 died in Tokyo in one night. This is prior to the atomic bombing. And he observed killing didn't bother me very much. It was getting the war over that bothered me. That was the prominent objective. So I wasn't worried particularly about how many people we killed. And then we dropped 2 bombs on Japan to protect our troops who would have had to go into Japan and fight a very difficult ground war to end the war, which we were sure to win, but it would cost lives, just like in the experiment that I told you. A recent book by Daniel Ellsberg, who was in the room with nuclear war planners after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was shocked by their plans. This was the beginning of the Cold War, and they were now aiming their nuclear missiles at the Soviet Union. And he described plans in this book, the aiming of the weapons that could kill hundreds of millions of people in the Soviet Union in the event of a nuclear, if they start a nuclear attack on the United States. He was horrified by the psychic numbing of the planners. These were just numbers 600 million might die, sure. The incoherence between the singular importance of protecting individual lives and the acceptability of mass killing is brought home in the much ridiculed proposal by a lawyer named Roger Fisher in 1981, who said that the secret code the American president needs to initiate a nuclear attack be implanted near the heart of a person whose life would have to be sacrificed to get the code and begin the process of killing millions. People were aghast that you would kill this man to get this code, and they weren't aghast about the process of killing millions, because that was the statistical, large numbers. But killing the one carried a lot of feeling that made this unacceptable. And in recent years, some of my colleagues like Herbert Lin from Stanford have written about this phenomenon, the fact that the minds that we have, our brains today still have some elements of things that protected us in the cave, and that was basically reliance on our feelings, which don't do this arithmetic very adequately. And the message of this paper is that decisions to use nuclear weapons cannot be rational, as they will unleash immense consequences that we are unable to comprehend. If we start to lose feeling about a life with 2 lives or 6 lives or 8 lives, how can we rationally weigh the benefits, the short-term benefits of using a nuclear weapon for some military or political gain against the long-term immense costs to humanity, to civilization? How can we weigh those if we can't comprehend the costs? We can't do it. So let me start to summarize this long rant in a sense. We are inconsistent and sometimes incoherent in our evaluation of human life. We value individual lives greatly, but these lives lose their value when they become part of a larger crisis. As a result, we do too little to protect human lives in the face of catastrophic threats from violence, natural disasters, and other serious causes. Life-saving judgments and decisions are highly context-dependent. They're dependent on many forms of response mode and framing effects and feeling biases. Slower and more introspective decision may reduce some of these biases, but they can also introduce serious biases like the prominence effect. That's not a fast, intuitive response. That is a decision to protect our security that is made slower and more thoughtful, and it is also problematic. We need to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the ways we think about risk as a necessary first step towards valuing lives humanely and improving our decisions. What more can we do to make better judgments and decisions now that we know about these things? Well, this is a big agenda that we need to work on now and in the future. But as a start, my colleagues and I have created a website called the Arithmetic of Compassion, arithmeticofcompassion.org, which aims to educate people about what I've been telling you today and give examples in what's going on in the world currently, that exemplifies psychic numbing, pseudo-inefficacy, and the prominence effect. And in this website we have a section called Take Action. What can you do now that you're aware of these things? Become aware of psychic numbing in yourself and raise awareness in others. Well, this website will help you do that. We need to harness the power of testimony, stories, images that will highlight the individual lives beneath the surface of the statistic and overcome numbing. With regard to the sense of inefficacy when the problem is a big problem, appreciate that even partial solutions can save whole lives. Don't let awareness of what you can't do stop you from doing what you can do. And one of the ways to amplify your own effectiveness is to get involved by joining and supporting organizations that dedicate themselves to these serious problems. And they are effective at that. Well, you can help them, and you can then become effective yourself through the help that you give to these other organizations. Okay, that brings me to the end of this lecture, and here's a few references. for the material that I've presented today. Thanks very much for hearing me out on this important topic.